Happy to welcome you to our concluding session of our extremely productive and for us exciting symposium here at San Jose State University, where we could not have felt more welcome and appreciated, perhaps more than we deserve. But thank you for being here. We are closing with a very important and interesting panel coming back to this issue of protest on campus and how to, all the verbs one chooses are potentially controversial. How to handle protest. Well, is protest to be handled, appreciated, enjoyed, regulated, worried about what is the appropriate posture to take, and I expect that's one of the issues that will come up. We have a great group of panelists, some of whom have been in the news, at least one of whom has been in the news for this subject, and superbly qualified moderator Neil Chase, former editor of the San Jose Mercury News, and now CEO of CalMatters, which I believe is a digital publication that's having great success. And thank you, Neil, for joining us, and I will turn things over to you right now.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me and inviting us. It's great to be back here, and see some familiar faces. I'm the CEO at CalMatters. We are a statewide news organization. We cover a lot of issues across California, including higher education. And so we've been talking a lot about what's been going on campuses lately. Not that protest and free speech on campus is a new issue, but it's certainly taken on some different tones lately. And we have three people with us who I think are going to help us explore this in some depth and with some great background. I'm going to introduce you as we go here, but I would love to have each of you start off by just giving your sense of what's going on right now. People, in the introduction, the idea that people don't even know how to react to what's going on right now. Is it free speech? Is it hate speech? Is it terrifying? Is it exhilarating? I would love your sense, if you had to describe somebody who has been through U.S. history, has seen some of the protests, think about Vietnam and other things in the past, what's going on now that's different? And why are we having a conversation now about how to handle this kind of speech when speech in the United States is not a new issue, right? And not something but there's something different going on right now. And I'd love to start to get at, if we can, what that is. I want to start with Jamienne Studley. You are the outgoing president, soon departing president of the Western Association of Schools and Colleges. You are the accrediting authority that puts the stamp of approval on all of these schools and makes sure they're doing what they should be doing and that they're up to snuff. You are yourself a former college president at Skidmore and attorney. So you've got a lot of different perspectives on this. But from your perch, studying the nation's colleges, what's happening now and how is it different?
To take you up on the opportunity. Okay. I would like to take you up on the opportunity to start way back and then come forward, and happy to talk about the role of accreditation in a moment. I learned about guiding and leading higher education institutions from the most wonderful of mentors, now Judge, then Dean Guido Calabresi. And he said something that has really stuck with me, which is when students are out in the streets, it's our job as educators to bring them in to learn what they need to know to do what they want to do and make the change they want to make. And when they're in the library studying away and attending to their books, it is our job to push them out, to engage with the world, and to use what we have taught them to accomplish what they want in the world. We are at a point right now where there is a lot of the first students in the streets, and a lot of what the faculty who are here today and the students who are here today are doing is engaging with the learning that they need to sort through some of the most complicated political, historic, justice, survival issues of our time. I was on campus in the Vietnam era, and on some of the other sessions here, there's been a little bit of a rosiness to the impression that we had. It's true that we had teach-ins on campus about the Vietnam War, and that is a wonderful model for saying, let's sit down and understand the history and the issues that are involved in this situation. But we shouldn't overstate the effectiveness of that model and think that that was a perfect time and ours is a flawed time of discourse, because I think if you had said to most of the people I was on the Columbia campus with, well, let's talk to the veterans, let's talk to the enlisted Marines about what they have done and just come back from, with the exception of John Kerry, who managed to rise above that debate and be heard as a veteran. We were learning then, and we are still learning now, how to have the kind of interchange that could make us able to really hear and understand each other and ask students to put their educations to use to do something about the things that worry them.
I think it's a human nature thing to always talk about how much better the past was than the way it is now, right? I was the editor of my college paper in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and the former editor, Tom Hayden, came to visit us, and we talked about how great it was when he was editor and how nobody cared about what we did now, and he said, oh no, we had the same conversation when I was the editor. You said something early on there about the idea that if they're our students, they're in our institutions, it's our job to teach them, it's our job to guide them, whether they're in the library or out in the streets. And, if they're and you don't get to say, well, they're not behaving the way I wish they were, so I'm now absolved from having to do that. We're still responsible for them when they're in our care, which is fascinating.
Care.
Okay.
Is maybe not
The wrong
today's
word.
word for how we're thinking about our students. Care deeply about them, care about their development, about their health and learning, but
They're our
do
customers.
also think, oh my God, let us try and avoid that. One of the best things about some of the finest teachers in schools I've ever been part of are they treated us as co-seekers of insight and learning. And I think that's the ideal way to engage our students. Fascinating.
Erwin Chemerinsky is the dean of the law school at Berkeley, founding dean of the UC Irvine Law School, and a constitutional scholar, among many other things, but especially relevant today in this conversation about the Constitution. You've spent a lot of time looking at these issues and thinking about them, and I'd love your take on what's going on right now.
Sure. I think we've got to be careful what we mean by right now. So far this year has been largely peaceful on campuses across the country. There certainly was something that occurred at Columbia at the beginning of the school year, but as much trepidation as I felt in August, we've just finished our 5th week of classes at Berkeley, and I take each quiet day as a blessing. So when we're talking about right now, we're really focusing on what happened last year.
Okay.
And it was an enormously difficult year at campuses across the country. I think that October 7th changed everything on so many campuses. And so what you saw at Berkeley was groups like the Students for Justice in Palestine celebrating what Hamas had done, and then a predictable reaction, especially from the Jewish students. I'll address the direct question that you posed, is how is this different? Because I too was in college during the Vietnam War. My recollection is that the students were largely all on one side, and it was oppositional to the administration. It wasn't that way last year. I've never seen the students so deeply divided as they were last year between those who were supporting the Students in Justice in Palestine, and though certainly not all the Jewish students were on one side, to a large extent they were, and we can talk about ways in which that divide became very difficult. It's hard to talk about, but the affinity groups at my law school and at many schools largely aligned with the Students for Justice in Palestine and left the Jewish students on the other side, which created a real racial dimension to the divide. And it seems an intractable divide. I don't know what the bridge is that will solve it, which may again go to talking about Vietnam, because the pro-Palestinian position has become that Israel should not exist. They literally mean from the river to the sea, it should be a Palestinian country. When they say, we don't want no two-state, we want 48, it's go back to 1948 when Israel didn't exist. But then on the other side, there are those who believe that the existence of Israel is essential. And it very much ties at a personal level, including to identity. Many of my students have loved ones in Israel or in Gaza. I have a number of students who lost family members in Israel or in Gaza. I have a student who has a relative who is a hostage and still a hostage in Israel. And it ties to their identity as individuals. So when you talk about trying to have teaching moments, it's very difficult to know when there's such a deep and seemingly unresolvable divide, how to deal with it. And then, of course, when you got to May, or actually even April, encampments arose at many different schools across the country. And the challenge for administrators was how to deal with that, because the encampments violated the school policies, their time, place, and manner rules. There was no First Amendment right to have the encampments. So the challenge for school administrators wasn't a legal or a constitutional challenge. It was one of what's politically desirable, what's prudent. And nothing seemed to work for college administrators. Some let the encampments remain, and then they erupted in violence. Is it UCLA or UC Irvine? Some used police. Some did nothing and were criticized. But it's interesting there that it wasn't about the law, but it was about what's a desirable way to react. And then there was all the disruptions at commencements, including at ours. And what do you do in that circumstance? We had the Solicitor General of the United States speaking, and a group of people were chanting the entire time that she was up there. What do you do? You could have them removed, but that's going to be even more disruptive. So there's similarities to what went on in Vietnam, but there's also profound differences.
If I could ask you to put your law professor hat on for a minute and explain a little more about the concept of time, place, and manner.
Sure. I think one of the most important things to remember is there's a fundamental difference in most of the country between public universities and private universities. Public universities have to comply with the First Amendment. Private universities don't. However, in California, there's a law that's called the Leonard Law that says that a private school cannot punish speech that a public school cannot punish because of the First Amendment. Even when there's a right to speak, it doesn't mean that there's a right to use government property at any moment in time in any way. And so the law has long been that the government, even for property open to the public, can have time, place, and manner restrictions. Classic example of this, an old case, a city said you can't have trucks with sound amplification equipment on public streets at nighttime. It's a time, place, manner restriction. Now it has to be what the law would call content neutral. It can't treat some messages differently from others. But there's no doubt that colleges and universities can have time, place, manner restrictions. The Berkeley campus has a rule that you can't have sound amplification equipment used on the campus, and that's a permissible time, place, manner restriction. Doesn't matter what your demonstration is about, you can't do that. College, university can say, no demonstrations near classroom buildings while classes are in session. That's a time, place, manner restriction. Universities can restrict the speech that goes on around dormitories, evenings and nighttime. That's a time, place, and manner restriction. And so campuses have rules that prevent people from camping out. And so encampments would have violated those rules. The question is whether the campuses politically wanted to enforce those time, place, manner restrictions.
Fascinating, thank you. Ralph Richard Banks is a law professor at Stanford. Not a professional journalist necessarily, but somebody who's written extensively and been published in a lot of newspapers. Probably has more bylines than me. You've written and researched a lot on race and equity in our society. And as we look at what's going on today, a big part of the conversation is about who's protesting, who has a voice, who should be given a voice, who should be given access, right? And at what point as Dean Chemerinsky just said, when an administrator makes a tough decision to do something or to do nothing, you are doing something that affects speech. You're also doing something that affects the group of people who are now speaking, right? So I'd love to hear if that's the right perspective to think about this, like how you see what's going on right now from that lens.
Thank you so much, and you can call me Rick, please.
Yes. On second reference,
as we say.
say.
Richard, I feel like I'm in trouble. My mother's, looming over my shoulder. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been worried as we were waiting to come out that we wouldn't have any disagreement among the panel, right? Which is probably the worst thing, because we're going to have a conversation about free speech, but we don't have much disagreement. And I agree with most of what my panelists have said. But let me try to at least create some disagreement here. I think, Erwin, I would disagree with the idea that October 7th changed everything. I think that October 7th merely brought to the fore what had been long simmering divisions on many college campuses, and it made more explicit the implications of decisions that administrators and university officials had made that maybe dated back a decade or more, right? So, for example, and I'll talk about this from the standpoint of Stanford, because we've had our own free speech controversy, shall we say. If you go back, one reason that let me take it to the university presidents, right? One reason the university presidents had a problem when they were testifying before Congress was that, one problem is that they kept referring to the First Amendment. As though the First Amendment is the guide. And in fact, for most private universities throughout the country, the First Amendment should not be the guide. It doesn't need to be the guide. They're not bound by the First Amendment. So their recourse to the First Amendment was really a way to abdicate responsibility rather than a way to embrace responsibility, right? The second problem they had is that they had already in their policies and practices at the University of Pennsylvania, at Harvard, also at Stanford, they had already begun to restrict speech in all manner of ways that lacked no real principled basis, right? They would react based on the crisis of the moment and respond to that crisis in a way that seems to address whoever's protesting at the moment and buy some peace. The problem with that is that it really did lead to a politicized campus where the students were in subtle ways at war with each other because they understand that the administration is ready and willing to come out on behalf and make statements and intervene and kind of enter the fray on behalf of some causes and not other causes, right? Just one example where that happens is that when the Supreme Court decided the Dobbs decision, Stanford, along with many universities, Stanford Law School in particular, we issued a statement decrying the decision. This was the abortion decision, right, where the court overturned Roe v. Wade, and I'm a supporter, right, of abortion rights, but the court overturned Roe v. Wade, and the school issued a statement about how this was such a horrible decision, and it was clearly on behalf of all the students who agreed that this was a horrible decision, and maybe there was pressure to make such a statement, which seems understandable until you pause to think about, well, what about the other 5, 10, 20, 30, 40% of students who don't think it was a horrible decision? What happens to them? I mean, they've just been othered, to use a common word, by the university. And do we expect them to take that line down? No, we don't. We expect them to fight back, which they did. So then you have these divisions on campus, and when October 7th happens, it's not surprising at all that there would be divisions among the students, because the divisions among the students have already been there. They've been there and they've been promoted, in fact, or instigated or exacerbated by policy decisions that university officials have made in response to political crises, but without recourse to any transcendent principles, much less faithfulness to core values.
How much of that division that you're describing, that, as you say, didn't start on October 7th, it parallels division in the country, right? It parallels the political division. We've always had political separation in this country, but we've got a level of political division now that there is precedent. We had a civil war. There have been other times when we've been this divided, but not lately. Are those two related? Is it the same problem? Is it different on college campuses because of how close people are together, or the age, or?
Well, actually, I think that, well, two things. One, I think the division in society is actually overstated, frankly, and we've had a similar dynamic happen in society as we have on college campuses, which is for many students, right, and this is true with the Israeli-Palestinian issue, many of them are what we might call in the middle. They recognize that the situation is complicated. Their equities are on both sides. They see complexity in the situation. They're not at either extreme. But what those students do, and this happens perhaps in society as well, their rational decision is to put their head down and try to stay out of the line of fire, because they know that there are kind of, figurative missiles being launched over their head. So they want to stay out of the line of fire.
And they're spending a lot of money for a degree.
And right. And what that means, though, is that we end up ceding the debate to the most extreme voices on each side, which is also what the function of social media, right? And with no offense to the media, but the media ecosystem works in the same way. So if you were to look at the media, CNN and Fox News and MSNBC, you don't get a sense of what Americans think. You get a sense of what extremes think, because that's the media model, is to cater, and it's perfectly rational, business-wise, to cater to the extremes. And we have the same dynamic playing out on college campuses, right? The tragedy of it is that the college campus should be a counterpoint to what happens in society. If there's any place where we should all be able to come together and have rational conversation that is on the merits and is not about identity and people retreating to their tribes, it should be the university.
It should be. Jamie?
Yeah, I'll pick up right there, maybe a couple of sentences back. Listening to the conversation at this conference over the last couple of days, one distinction that stands out is between AI, the electronic world, where what you're seeing are the comments mostly of strangers or influencers or public figures, or stray people, but that you deal with only electronically. In a campus situation, whether the campus is at the scale of the schools that Sandy and I were president of, small, under 2,000 students, 800 employees and staff, where you really could imagine having a conversation, or 35,000 or more. I'm using San Jose State's current record, yearly enrollment. One of the great things about it that we might be able to, that we're seeking ways to capitalize on, are that we have, as a professor so eloquently said, we have multiple identities, and we run into each other. We may have someone with whom we disagree, and we are also on the soccer team with them. We had contrary viewpoints in class, and not to overstate the physical, but we show up in yoga with them, or we're next to them in the coffee line, or to get our burrito. And that creates an opportunity to think of ourselves as, to see what we share, and then to see how we can broaden that to ideas. We may sit next to each other in class, whether it's the science class that a professor in yesterday's group was saying she could not imagine preparing science educators without actually thinking, letting students find ways to understand about identity and power and fear, and that her classroom had to do it even though the substance was not connected. But compared to the Twitter sphere, or whatever we call it now, the fact that we do have engagement and we do understand that we have many parts, many interests. The same person who's taking a political science class may also be sharing the vegan house or the a class on poetry with you, and there are opportunities for bridges. That's a very optimistic view on these hardest of issues. I think many of us in higher education wish that we had started 10 years ago to think more about creating the setting for the kind of discourse that we want to be able to have now, so that the middle and everyone can speak to each other together.
If I could just add, because you made so many crucial points, right? Crucial points, and my take home from that is that the First Amendment inquiry for those universities that are not bound by it, especially, it's the wrong question. The right question is, how do we create a vibrant learning community? How do we create a vibrant learning community, which requires both that people be able to explore openly, freely, a full range of ideas, and also that they be able to do that together in a spirit of shared exploration? That's the question.
Well, I agree with you where you started, that it's not October 7th that caused this. It was just a flashpoint that brought to the surface things in a really long time. I very much disagree with you that private universities shouldn't follow the principles of the First Amendment. They don't have to constitutionally, except here in California by statute. But I believe that academic freedom, which is interrelated with the First Amendment, are crucial to what universities are about. And so I believe that private universities, though they don't have to follow the principles of the First Amendment, should follow the principles of the First Amendment. And of course, most private universities, in their faculty and student handbooks, do pledge that they're going to protect freedom of speech. Many courts have said those are contracts, and so there's a legal obligation to do so as well.
Speaking for the journalism profession, I'd love to have them follow the Public Records Act laws too, but please.
But let me just add, so I may have misstated. I was not saying that private universities should not follow the First Amendment, right? Okay. I was saying that if your center of gravity is what's the First Amendment, what does the First Amendment dictate, what are the requirements of the First Amendment, if that's your orientation, you're down the wrong path.
Or your excuse.
Your excuse. You're asking the wrong questions, and that's why the presidents, one of whom was our former dean, got in trouble at that congressional testimony because it became clear that they really had no answer to the question of, like, what animates your university? Like, what are the values and the principles that you hold dear and that you want to further? They had no answer to that question other than, we follow the law.
I disagree.
And that's not a good answer for an academic leader.
I disagree with you in how you characterized the hearing. It was the fourth hour of a tense hearing. The problem was that the question that they were asked for an emotional response, and they gave a very legalistic response. What they said was right. What Stefanik had asked was, would your campus prohibit the advocacy of genocide towards Jews? And they should have given a very emotional response saying that of course our campus would condemn that, but whether there is a right to say it, of course, as Liz McGill said, depends on context. There is a First Amendment right for the most corporate. No,
University of Pennsylvania is private, though. And there's no linear law in Pennsylvania.
No, they didn't have to follow the First Amendment. They had an easy answer saying, we're private universities, we don't have to. But I think the core of the First Amendment, of academic freedom, is that all ideas and views can be expressed, period. Of course, if advocacy of genocide becomes incitement, or becomes a true threat, or it's harassment, then it's not protected at public or private university. But what Liz McGill said was right, because what she was saying is a campus can't ban an idea from being expressed. I think the problem was she presented it as a legalistic answer to a question asking for an emotional response.
I agree with that, but the thing that people were so upset about, I think there, is that at those universities, at Harvard and at Penn, and at Stanford as well, and many other universities, we have had years where we have micromanaged speech in all sorts of ways. That was the backdrop for the testimony. And I have a colleague who Erwin, who got in trouble, like big trouble, for quoting from a Supreme Court opinion, because the Supreme Court opinion had an epithet in the opinion, and he dared to read the opinion in a major Supreme Court case. It's Phelps v. Snyder. And so if you've been policing speech all along over the last several years, you've been restricting who can say what, and often with good intentions on behalf of disadvantaged groups, right? You want to, quote, protect them. If you've been doing that, and then when it comes to Jews, you basically say, well, free speech governs, that does feel kind of anti-Semitic, actually. We're going to police speech when it's directed against certain groups, but then free speech is going to govern when it's directed against this group. That does feel to me very anti-Semitic, actually.
Let me just share real quickly that we want your questions as well, and there are QR codes for you to send those in. We'll take those. I'm just curious.
Just a very brief reaction. Yeah.
No, right.
Very brief reaction. I think you've really said something important about it suddenly seeming like, oh, wait a minute, you've been willing to talk about hate speech and be very, as you said, directive, but now you are suddenly absolutist and people can say anything they want to say. I think that appeared to be a shift, whether or not it was. But I just want to make one more point, and then Erwin.
And then I want to disagree with both of you.
I cannot picture a situation in which private institutions would wisely have said that they did not have to follow the First Amendment. It's a line that I just think would have been unwise. It is so deeply compelling for us as a nation, and the First Amendment is so precious. One might want to talk about under these circumstances or in these particular cases, but for those three institutions and those leaders to have stood up and said, we're private, we don't have to follow the First Amendment, I think would have been very
I'm not
impelling.
advocating that people violate the First Amendment. Again, just to be very clear, I'm not advocating that people violate the First Amendment, even when they're not required to follow it. What I am saying is that as a matter of academic policy, the First Amendment should not be the starting point of that inquiry. That's not the question you're trying to answer. Now, I happen to think that if you start with this question of how do we create a vibrant community, does that keep you on the right side of the First Amendment? Well, yeah, it does. But that's a very big difference between starting with the question of how do we comply with the First Amendment versus starting with the question of how do we create a vibrant academic community.
I think
this
that's
is kind of a law professor's distinction.
I want to
there.
disagree on both sides of me. I think that's a false distinction because I don't think you can have a vibrant academic community without having, in a public university, the First Amendment, in a private university, the commitment to free speech that the First Amendment puts on public universities, and academic freedom. So to say we have to start with how do we create a vibrant academic community and distinguish that from the First Amendment, freedom of speech and academic freedom, is to me a false distinction because we won't have a vibrant academic community without the underlying principles of freedom of speech, without the underlying principles of academic freedom.
Or is that and then I'll let this go. But because my argument is really, it's not that the First Amendment does too much or that it restricts us too much. The problem is that it doesn't do enough, right? And this is, I think, the problem that was on display in the testimony, if you will, and at these universities, is that if they're fixated on following the First Amendment, there will be questions you should be asking yourself, policies you should be thinking about, programs you should be offering, all sorts of other stuff that will just never come into view because you satisfy yourself with, well, we're complying with the First Amendment. But that's not enough to create. So it may be necessary, but it's not sufficient.
We agree with that. Of course it's not sufficient. There's many things that have to go into being an educational institution. But it is, I think, necessary, essential that there be freedom of speech and academic freedom. That I think those are core aspects with regard to what we're trying to achieve in universities. I also don't, let me just say one more thing. I don't accept the characterization that each of you have had is that for decades, universities have been suppressing speech, and now all of a sudden they won't stop anti-Semitic speech, so that makes them seem anti-Semitic. I don't accept that characterization that there's been massive censorship of speech on campuses. In the early 1990s, over 360 college universities adopted free speech codes. Every one to go to court, including the Stanford one, was ultimately struck down as either unconstitutional or violating the Leonard Law. I was on the Berkeley campus in 2017 when the conservative patriot group said they were going to have Free Speech Week. And Carol Christ, who spoke here yesterday, decided to spend $4 million to protect the right of those individuals to speak on campus. I could give you an almost infinite list of examples where controversial speakers have been allowed. So yes, I'll agree there are instances where campuses, sometimes in the name of political correctness, have restricted speech they shouldn't, but I very much disagree with the characterization that that's been widespread.
A genuine disagreement. So I think it has been widespread. I joke with a colleague of mine that we're on these matters, that when conservatives criticize universities and they want to cite all the bad stuff that they think is going on in this regard, our honest response is you don't know the half of it. There is a lot of bad stuff that goes on. It's not informal policies. But are there have students and faculty been taken to task for all manner of statements? I think the answer is actually yes, they have, and I think that's been documented at universities around the country.
Difference that you're talking about is between the protection of the visible outside speaker or the debate that has rightly been honored, and I think in some ways easier to understand. It's the daily, am I allowed to say that? That at least some people feel that there are speech codes that would not be consistent with the First Amendment in how the citizens of the institution may speak.
There is a crucial and vital distinction between when the university punishes speech or stops speech and social pressure among individuals that may cause individuals to choose to be silent. I don't minimize the importance of the latter. And of course, we all learn from a young age. There are things we shouldn't say in public and say to others. And so that social pressure that exists is an outgrowth of that. I worry about that students in my classes who are conservative don't feel comfortable speaking, no matter how much there's no sanctions for doing so. But I think we make an enormous mistake if we equate that social pressure with institutional choices with regard to speech.
You think that there is a divide between policy and practice of the institution on one hand and the social pressures among students on the other?
Absolutely.
And okay, so I think that the social dynamics among the students are often a consequence of the cues that they take from the faculty and the administration.
Does the university,
in the same way that when your children do something, you like, one time my son said a bad word, and I'm like, where did you learn that? And my
From
son
you?
said, yeah, from you. It's like, and that's how it works.
But there's a difference between the cues that the faculty may give and the institution allowing or punishing speech. And I think what you just said, what was said earlier, makes it seem that those are the same. And I think there's a vital difference between institutional regulation of speech, which is then about the First Amendment and academic freedom, and
can I
social
ask, just
pressure.
Jamie, from your
But it's hate speech codes that are the institutional embodiment. I agree with you about student to student should be careful about what we say, and we should think about the consequences as well as the importance of what we want to convey. But there is a slice in there that at some institutions is a formal adoption of policy that sometimes risks abrogating speech in the interests of protection.
Well, and I think the hate speech codes were well-intentioned, but unconstitutional and undesirable. And that's why every court to consider it struck down.
Let me pause because I know we got a couple of questions, John. And if you got one ready you want to share, we can jump in now.
Yeah, I think Nina actually has the first question that we're going to start off with, and I'll go next.
Yeah, so we have a number of questions that are coming in. So we're going to start off with the top voted questions. The first one is, how can campuses promote civil discourse on differing opinions? How can we as a community and as a campus help students and our community members learn to communicate with others who have different opinions?
Which I think plays on something all three of you were saying in different ways, which is there's one level of dealing with hate speech or dealing with that high visibility, controversial speaker, but what is the institution's responsibility to actually, what you said earlier, Jamie, right, to bring people in and coach them and guide them to the right kind of openness?
I'd start by saying three things. First, the institution has to articulate its values. There has to be statements of the institution as an institution and by the leaders of the institution that they are committed to having open discourse, civil debate over the whole range of issues. And in this way, I think we would all agree. Second, the institution has to model that. That I think there's a responsibility of the leaders in the institution and the faculty to model what we want to teach our students with regard to civil discourse. And I think we'd probably all agree with that as we were talking about the cues. And third, the institutions have to provide for this to occur, that there has to be education of students about how to engage in constructive dialogue and to have dialogue over difference. I think it's great for institutions to provide programs where they have speakers who come who strongly disagree, but can show how it's possible to disagree without being disagreeable. And so the institution has to provide the forums and the mechanisms to teach students about it.
You brought up in your classes, you mentioned you're concerned sometimes that the more conservative students don't feel like they have a chance to speak. Is it your responsibility to open that door, to bring them out, to allow that speech?
Yes, but it's very difficult to do. Let me tell you an anecdote. In the spring of 2021, we were entirely online because of COVID. And I was teaching constitutional law. And I said that the students could either speak by raising their hand or they could write comments in the chat. And only I would see the comments, and I would read aloud whatever they wrote. I got more conservative comments that way than I've ever had in class.
Anonymously.
As anonymous, but the next spring of 2022, I taught the same class, did everything I could to encourage the open dialogue in that, and yet I didn't get that. And I'll present the conservative side when nobody is there to present the conservative side. I'll structure the discussion, say, what's the argument on the other side? But I believe that there is the kind of social pressure that we're talking about to not take certain positions.
Jamie, can I ask, in your role, we have people on stage from two very large, prestigious law schools, right? But in your role, working with a lot of different colleges up and down this part of the country, you're working with administrators at large schools and small. Like you mentioned, the scale of what you ran at Skidmore was different. People who are running state universities and community colleges and things. What is the atmosphere like for them? How are they confronting this, and how are they can they even manage it?
I don't know whether you meant the hard job is at the larger schools or the smaller schools. I think it's not
I'm asking the question. I don't know.
Right? The one phrase from yesterday, I'm really glad I showed up early, Sandy. One phrase from yesterday's conversation was, how do you build trust at scale? It was from one of the people here at San Jose State who works on that issue all the time in terms of community leadership and campus development. And the scale is whatever scale you have. A large school like San Jose State has found ways, and people create their own communities and clusters within which you can build those conversations, whether it's academic or the way people live or identifications that you can bridge. We've been trying different versions of those kinds of cross-fertilizations and conversations for a long time. I liked Erwin's three-part recipe, and one thing that institutions can contribute is students understand when you're putting in those things that are precious to you. Class time is the most precious resource that institutions have. The time of its leaders, the time of the president and the provost to engage with an issue. Modeling doesn't just mean, I know if you're here, I'm probably speaking to the choir. Modeling doesn't just mean have somebody we disagree with and let them speak. It actually means have a conversation back and forth of the kind that Erwin was talking about in class, where you actually see somebody respectfully challenge or interrogate or ask follow-up questions to really unpack and peel the onion, and to see what it looks like to try and understand somebody who comes to a different conclusion than you do. I watch really good reporters do it. I know we have a strand of journalists here who are getting better and better right now at fact-checking and asking people to respond or be clearer or to go down deeper and not just use the soundbite, but to think about the implications of what they're suggesting and how it might work. That's what teachers do. And I think we can take the best of teachers and journalists and actually embody it. And if there are faculty who say, this is hard for me, I haven't taught that way before, another precious resource is when we do development of our staff and faculty and we take the time to make that a priority. What are the skills that some people are doing superbly and others would like to practice?
Yeah, when you mentioned trying to build trust at scale, it's obviously a problem for journalism as well. I'm going to go, I think we have another question, John.
Thank you. This is from an anonymous user. Can you discuss the unspoken impact of regulations of free speech on privilege and low-income communities on college campuses?
Are we talking about sort of the disproportionate impact on communities that already don't have a voice if the campus doesn't become the place that they're allowed to speak?
I believe that's what the question is getting at, yes.
I'm not sure I can speak to that in the richness and depth that the questioner might be seeking, and it's worth its own session. One thing that I worried about and thought of bringing into this conversation as I was coming down was that power differences among people mean that any restriction there is always the danger that any restriction will fall most heavily on the people who don't have the power, that don't have the power to sometimes command the microphone, or whose utterances are discounted more than those of other people, or who don't have access to the lawyers to protect them or the pre-existing relationships with the administrators to stand up for them. I'm not saying that that's true at any particular institution, but it's a fair question how any set of rules falls on the people who are least able to get to the levers of power and authority.
Does this concept of academic freedom and, Erwin, you explained the intersection of the First Amendment and academic freedom, right? They're the same concept. Does the idea of academic freedom, which would suggest we need to be open to all voices, does that also create a responsibility to draw out voices that are not being heard, like you trying to get your conservative voices out in your class?
Sure. Yes, I think there's that obligation. If I could respond to the question briefly, and then I do want to clarify, because First Amendment academic freedom aren't the same. But I think it's also important to recognize that first-generation students experience college differently than those who weren't first-generation students. That those who have to work in order to be able to go to college experience college differently and have less opportunity to participate in things like the protests that are on campus. We can also talk about the effects of hate speech on groups that have traditionally been excluded. I think of academic freedom in the First Amendment, if Venn diagrams are useful, as overlapping circles. That there's things that are protected by the First Amendment that aren't protected by academic freedom. Academic freedom is really about the ability of faculty in their classrooms, in their scholarship, and conveying their scholarship to the public to express themselves. If a professor goes to a rally on the weekend, that's not protected by academic freedom. But if it's a professor at a public university, you couldn't fire that professor for doing so, even if students are upset about it. Academic freedom will protect things that the First Amendment doesn't. As we've talked about, the First Amendment doesn't apply in private universities, but academic freedom certainly does. Academic freedom is about the professional obligation that exists with regard to scholars and teachers, and so there is a responsibility that's attendant to it, whereas generally we don't attach a responsibility to the First Amendment. So there's a professional role that goes with academic freedom that's not the First Amendment. And then there's so much that we'd say that's protected by both the First Amendment and academic freedom, and so much that's protected by neither. Neither is absolute. If we assign a teacher to instruct in a certain subject and the professor refuses and goes into the classroom and teaches about other things, or if a history professor denies the Holocaust, that doesn't live up to professional standards. That professor could be disciplined for it. When professors are evaluated for promotion or tenure, we look at the quality of their work by professional standards. And so all of that is also still encompassed within the notion of academic freedom.
I appreciate you bringing up the different situations students are in, right? You're 19, you've left home to go to a small liberal arts campus with 2,000 people somewhere, and you live there 24/7. You're in that community where you're going to run into people 12 times a day. At our state universities, a lot of people are parents. A lot of students are parents. Or they're taking care of their own parents or relatives or both, and they're working a job and all sorts of other things. So it's a very different environment in which even to have the opportunity to get your voice out, right?
To add to what Erwin said, which I agree with, of course, and it's very useful to clarify that academic freedom and the First Amendment are not one and the same.
It would help if the moderator didn't suggest that.
With a lot of these issues, though, we should be attentive to all the line drawing difficulties here, right? So the earlier question talked about speech and how free speech might disadvantage already disadvantaged groups was the way I took it, right? And I think most people would think that it's perfectly fine to protect people from assaults on their identity, right? That doesn't serve the goals that the university is promoting. But it's really difficult to draw a line and to figure out where does assaultive speech end and where does speech that you just disagree with begin, right? And so if students come to the president or the dean and say, so-and-so is saying X, Y, and Z, and we think this is assaulting us on the basis of our identity and making us feel like we don't belong, the administrator has to answer the question, well, is that speech really assaulting you on your basis of your identity? Is it akin to calling you a racial epithet, say? Or is it just speech that you don't agree with? And that's a hard line. And one of the places where that line has come up in the Israeli-Palestinian issue, of course, is over this issue of Zionism. And if groups of students say they're anti-Zionist, is that itself hate speech? Or is that a permissible political position with which other people simply disagree and therefore have to put up with?
I got an email earlier this week from a student in a class, and I think I can do this when it's anonymous, who very strongly disagreed with the opinions expressed by another student in the class. It wasn't directed at anybody in particular. There were no epithets, but I regarded these, she said, the views he expressed as white supremacist. And she said, you shouldn't allow him to say these things. She said, this is violence against me. This makes me feel unsafe. And of course, the response has to be that the nature of a university is ideas will be expressed that you don't like, and that's not violence. The most frequent thing, if you talk to deans and campus administrators now, is when students are upset about something, they phrase it as, it makes me feel unsafe to have that expressed. And then it's our responsibility to say, no, there's really a difference between expressing ideas and views you don't like and something that's a threat or a violence against you, but it's sure not perceived that way.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with that, but I think it's also the case that universities have not adhered to the approach that you just described. And the violations have not been just here and there, right? They've been pervasive. Because, when the student says, I feel like that's violence against me and now I don't feel like I belong, your heart goes out to them, right? And, this is a big problem, actually. And it's encouraging that I think now a number of universities are reassessing and they are realizing the importance of the principle that you just described.
I think we have another question.
Yes, our next question is, how can campus administrators better model allowing people to question our values, beliefs, etc.?
Campus administrators. So, Jamie, you talked a little bit about the responsibility to at least do some development work with the faculty, right, to get them better prepared.
I'll just give you one example, is that because I really do feel, and I'm a parent of 3 children, and it's one of the lessons of parenthood is that your children really do model themselves after not what you've told them, but your behavior, right? Your behavior speaks so loudly that they can't hear your words. And that's what's happened a lot on our college campuses. And one place where I see this still happening, frankly, is that a lot of universities have changed their policies recently. Sometimes those universities, when they make changes about their sort of their regulation of speech, they don't really admit the extent of the change they're making. They don't really admit the extent of what they allowed to happen before. They simply say, we're clarifying our position. A faculty committee has recognized and we adopt a position. But all that stuff before that happened that people know about, which is contrary to your new position, you just never delve into that, right? Because, like, why would you want to do that? That would be bad publicity. You don't need to. But the consequence of that is that they never regain the trust of people, because it's hard for someone to trust you, even if you're saying the right thing now, if they know you did the wrong thing before and you've never really owned up to it. Right, and this is a problem that happens on university campuses. And I'll add, perhaps gratuitously, that this also happens in our nation, right? When you think about our national history and genocide and slavery and segregation, all of this stuff, we don't like looking back and sort of owning that, right? And it's really an American, it's maybe an outgrowth of this American optimism, forward-looking quality, sense of the American dream, that we don't want to look back, but there's a cost to that.
And I like how you explained that the cost is trust. The cost is, in which case that new policy means nothing because people don't trust what you said.
And next question is pretty profound. What is hate speech and who gets to decide?
That's the next panel, right?
Question. I'll just say a little here. I mean, I think these are hard. I don't have an answer to that question, but it is a hard problem. And the one thing we can't do, frankly, is that which we have done, which is a bad thing, is to rely on the people who are arguing that they've been harmed to define hate speech. So, Erwin, when your student comes and says, my classmate said X, Y, and Z, and I think that's white supremacy, and it makes me feel unsafe, and they're smart enough to hit all the little buzzwords that you hit. It can't be that that person gets to define what counts as hate speech. Because their definition of hate speech, if you accept it, it will shape the entire community and the entire law school experience for all the other students. And we can't cede that power to any individual students who are complaining. The sad part is that we often have ceded that power to individual students when they complain.
I strongly agree with that. I think it's important in answering the question to know that hate speech is generally protected by the First Amendment. That the most frequent question that I get in talking about the First Amendment is, where's the line between free speech under the First Amendment and hate speech? And that's a false dichotomy, because in the United States, hate speech generally is protected. I mentioned earlier that in the early 1990s, 360 college universities adopted hate speech codes. When they tried to define hate speech, they largely adopted the laws that had been initiated and implemented in European countries. And so in European countries, hate speech is often defined as, and I can quote, speech that stigmatizes or demeans on the basis of race, sex, religion, sexual orientation. So one of the very first challenges that was brought was to a University of Michigan hate speech code. And again, it was well-intentioned. It followed some horrible incidents on the Michigan campus, and it adopted the European definition of hate speech. A graduate student who was doing research on whether there's inherent differences between men and women in certain things said, I'm afraid that my research could be deemed to stigmatize or demean on the basis of sex. And the federal court struck it down as being unconstitutionally vague and overbroad. Also, under the First Amendment, as I've said, its very core is that all ideas and views can be expressed. And hate speech, as vile as it can be, is still expressing an idea and a view. So that doesn't mean it's absolute. If hate speech crosses the line and meets the legal test for incitement, or becomes a true threat, or it becomes harassment, but there isn't a good definition of hate speech, which is part of why all the codes were struck down.
Do we have another?
Simplistic, but I think one way to look at some of these questions is to be prepared with a response at the level of, and what can we do about it? when you disagree with somebody, I mean, I probably, and I mean, purely respect for them, kindergarten teachers probably have words that they use when somebody does something that is not acceptable in that cultural situation. That is, and Rick, what do you think we could do about it? You're right. What she did was, we don't like that here in our kindergarten. And we need the university equivalent of that. And I think we have people who do it quite well. Sometimes they're in particular jobs and centers. Sometimes everybody knows who in the department is good at saying, well, wait a minute. As the teacher, I was really uncomfortable when that person said it. I think she's right in the characterization of the views, but it's not my job to say you can't say that here. But what could I have done? Or what could students do who want to say, we want a conversation in which we can explore rights and laws without doing it in that way, not with, right back where Erwin started. It's not institutional rules. It's actually ways that we, who have the privileges of time, sometimes to do these things that we don't have in the public, we have, for better or for worse, some chance to do it face-to-face. And we have assets of people who can help us think about that. We have some expectation that the community continues that's different from my seeing something on my Facebook feed that I find disgusting but elect not to engage with.
Kindergarten example, and that actually helps me to answer Neil's opening question, which is how are things different now? And one of the ways I think things are different is that when I started teaching at Stanford in 1998, and I think at that time, we would have been more likely to say to the student, well, what are you going to do about it? Or to the student who writes to Erwin and says, oh, this other student says something as a white supremacist, we might have said, well, perhaps you should talk to them. Now, students want to call on the university to come in and be the one to solve the problem. And that's a difference. When I was an undergraduate student in the 80s, we wanted to be free from the oversight and control of the university. Like, that's what it was all about, was being free from the university. Now people want to bring the university in just on their side. And that's a central difference between 30 or 40 years ago and today.
I'm back on Jamie's description. I mean, the question is, what would Mr. Rogers do, right? John, how are we doing?
I think we have time for one more. Nina, do you want to ask?
Yes. Can you discuss the unspoken... Oh, that's not the one. Do you think that we have the right to be free from hate speech? Or is that one of the prices we pay to live in a society that protects free expression?
It's very parallel, Rick, to what you were just saying about what people expect from the university, right?
Put it very well. We can use all the other tools that we have to counter it and to heighten the voices that we think are not hateful and that are constructive. But I think the person really nailed it.
Well, I was just gonna add. I think that one of my as I hear a conversation about hate speech, I just feel so much that the category has probably gotten way too large, right? So I've had lots of students, just as Erwin relates, I've had lots of students approach me over the years, and they're complaining about this, complaining about that, and my view often is that the thing you're complaining about should be part of a wide-ranging dialogue. Not only should we not ostracize that as something that was inappropriate, it's actually something that we should want in the classroom, and we should want to be on the university campus. So one of the things that we need to, as academics, need to be constantly on guard about is this tendency of the idea of hate speech, or whatever you want to call it, of hate speech to expand and occupy ever more space. Right, and my last thought is that expansion of hate speech, I think often it's in bad faith on the part of people who are arguing for the expansion. They're not like, I don't know if you're a student, or Erwin, to go back to this example, who says, oh, this is white supremacy, makes me feel unsafe as though I don't belong. I almost would want to sit down with that student and say, do you really feel unsafe because your classmate said something in class that you don't agree with? Or are you trying to use the idea of your feeling unsafe as a way to just win an argument that you're not willing to try to win on the merits? And we need to be able to acknowledge that often that's what's going on. But administrators, for all sorts of obvious reasons, are unwilling to make that acknowledgement, even when the bad faith is apparent.
I agree with what you said. I'll answer the question slightly differently. As I understood, the question was, is there a right to be protected from hate speech? And I'll give an example. In the late 1970s, the Nazi Party wanted to march through Skokie, Illinois. It was then a predominantly Jewish suburb and a large number of Holocaust survivors. And they said we should be able to be protected by the government and exclude the hate speech. It caused us great emotional suffering. And every court to rule said that the Nazis had the right to march through the sidewalks. Now, colleges also have an obligation, a moral obligation, a legal obligation under Title VI and Title IX to protect students from a hostile learning environment. But there are many things that they can do and must do without restricting speech that's protected by the First Amendment.
I think we're at time. Is that right? Rick, Erwin, Jamie, thank you so much for a fascinating conversation. I know we could do this for a couple more hours if we had the time. And thanks, everybody, for being here.